Good morning, everyone. First sunrise of the new year. Clear to the horizon. Let's hope that this clarity is a good sign for the coming year. Welcome back to the channel, by the way, and Happy New Year. This is Behind the Door, and I'm Kevin O'Donnell. And, as we close out 2021, I kind of look back on my year in photography, and I see how it really was a watershed year for me. I mean, starting last year about this time, building out my new studio, getting this YouTube channel going. Thank you very much for all your kind input. And then, entering in a juried exhibit and being selected for the prestigious Hardy Gallery up in Door County, up in Ephraim. And then having my own solo exhibit in Chicago that turned out really well. Buying a printer, that's probably done more to improve my photography this year than anything else. So just out here for a walk this morning on this beautiful clear morning, and trying to bring in the new year. And I have something I want to share with you. So, with all of these changes from last year, it's really brought about some unexpected notoriety, let's say. Not that I'm complaining, it's just something I'm not used to dealing with, and especially for someone who's really a quite private person, it takes some adjustment. And I'd have to say that among the biggest and surprising things that occurred last year were in interfacing with the public about my work, were how many times people asked me, so what's your favorite photograph? I don't think I can pick just one, but I thought maybe I owed it to you to kind of put together a group of photos. So I began distilling down my photographs from the year, kind of a subjective and somewhat arbitrary exercise, to be frank, to a 10 favorites list with the help of Lightroom's 5-star rating system. And I continued to refine that process, keep distilling it, kind of like a fine scotch, to determine how many images from the 65 photo excursions that I went on in 2021, how many of those photos I would deem portfolio worthy, or 4 or 5 stars. And I'll spare you the boring analytical details on how I got to that, but that number turns out to be 25. 25 photographs, only 1% of all the pics I took for a year. And 17 of those images were 4 stars and 8 were only 5 stars. That's about 0.3%. So I'd like to show you now and explain to you why I chose these particular 10. And it turned out to be an interesting exercise because it revealed some trends and some commonalities and some personal biases, that's for sure. 7 out of the 10 were from locations that I'd never been to before, or at least not photographed before. Not surprising, I suppose, but of the 3 locations where I had previously photographed, they were all of one place. Just different perspectives at different times of the year and different subjects. And nearly all of the winners, can I say that? Winners? It doesn't sound right. All of the selections were what I call challenge photographs. In other words, I pushed myself to use techniques that I've never attempted before, like planning for an eclipse and capturing lightning. The storm's coming in across the lake, and I actually want to be out here for this storm. So, crazy, I know, but I'm trying to get some lightning shots. And exposure blending night scenes in Photoshop. And most photographers will tell you that their favorite photos are the ones that took the most effort, the ones that were the most difficult to execute, were the furthest outside of their comfort zone in terms of experience and skill, but in many cases resulted in exceeded expectations. And that was certainly true for me, I have to say. And oddly, in this group of 10, there is not one of people. No portraits or street photography. There were a couple that made it to the semifinals, but they never made it to the final round. So all of the photos I'm about to show you are either landscapes, seascapes, or night photography, astro landscapes. And one final thing that factored into my decision-making process is the emotional element, and this is where the bias comes in, I suppose. All of these photos have a deep personal connection, and they're just so meaningful to me on a multitude of levels and for so many reasons. Anyway, let's take a look at the what, when, where, why, and how of what I consider to be my top 10 favorite photos for 2021. First up is an image that I have not previously shared, but you can see it hanging over my shoulder here. It's from along the Lady Bird Johnson Grove Trail in the Redwoods National Park in Northern California. And the challenge for me on this shoot, aside from just getting to the location due to rock slides and closed roads and detours, was dealing with the constant rain and an endless parade of tourists, and trying to compose a subject, when the subjects around you are 250 feet tall and up close, and you're at the bottom of it. So I guess my one option was to find a scene within a scene and incorporate the mist to help make order out of that chaos. It helps minimize the background distractions and places less emphasis on the sky, which I really couldn't avoid. And it just amplifies the overall rainforest ambiance. I used a circular polarizing filter to bring out the colors, particularly the greens, and to eliminate the glare from the wet leaves. I worked for about 20 minutes trying to get the best angle of this scene, and it was the first time I had used my new Rogetti geared tripod head, which really allowed me to dial in my composition to the millimeter and optimize the placement of those tree trunks throughout the image, giving the whole scene more space and kind of simplifying the scene. What really impressed me about this was this tree's ability to seemingly pay it forward, acting as a surrogate, nurturing new life from just the stump of its charred remains. And with the exception of just minimal cropping and a slight boost in contrast, this image is straight out of the camera. Okay, this is a photo of the annular solar eclipse that took place at 5:03 on the morning of June 10th, and this is from near the entrance of the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal here in Door County, the first of three. Now, astronomical forecasts such as these are incredibly accurate and easy to predict, but meteorological forecasts, unfortunately, are not. And I planned this event weeks in advance, knowing that the lighthouse would make such a great foreground alignment, and it would just be beautiful at sunrise. I even went through a dress rehearsal at this location a few days before the event to make sure everything was all right. But the one wild card that I couldn't count on was the weather. Now, I made a behind the door episode depicting how I went about planning and executing this. And in it, I'd have to say it captured plenty of anxiety along the way. So the capriciousness of the weather that morning only made me more frustrated. And then just as I was about to throw in the towel and pack it all up, the fog lifted, like raising the bottom hem of a curtain. And suddenly all my anxiety just melted away, and I was able to capture this image. And I remember thinking that it seemed odd that I was the only photographer out on the beach that day. Oh yeah, this tree, solitary, seen here surrounded by just gently waving fields and regimented rows of new spring corn at her feet. She's topped with a beautiful emerald crown, and she always stands like this, like a queen on the prairie. I am so drawn to this old maple. Her many moods, her seasonal wardrobes, and it seems that there's always a pastel sky behind her. This is a focus stacked and blended photo of 8 images to capture the pin sharp focus front to back using a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. It is deceptively simple looking, but it's really a hodgepodge of geometrics that break all the rules of composition. Rule number 1, use a palette of complementary colors. While there isn't just one palette of complementary colors here, there are 3, and they're all interconnected. First, there is the blue and the gold of the sky, and then there is the mauve in the sky and the greens of the foliage below, and then there's the greens of the foliage and the umber-colored earth between the rows of corn. Rule number 2, use leading lines to draw your eye to the subject. Well, there's not one set of leading lines here, but 4. A, parallel lines running from the bottom edge of the photo to the tree. B, intersecting with perpendicular lines that are underneath those rows of corn. C, intersecting parallel lines along the horizon that run perpendicular to the trunk of the tree. And then D, another set of parallel lines with complementary colors this time, running horizontally and edge to edge across the sky behind the tree. And then we haven't even talked about the circular center yet. Rule number 3, balance your photo with a mirrored image. So you cut this image in half, left and right, and it's nearly identical. But the photo contains a distinct bottom and top half too, all of which is united together like a Venn diagram with this big circular crown of the tree directly in the center of the photo. Remarkably, it works. It's not supposed to, but it works. On to photo number 4. The first of 2 photos in this top 10 gallery that are exposure blended. This is from the Samuel H. Boardman State Scenic Corridor along Highway 101 near Brookings, Oregon, at a viewpoint called Arch Rock. And it was on the night of the new moon back in July that, lucky for me, was the first night in over 2 weeks, the locals told me, that was not socked in by fog. Now, when I say this was exposure blended, what I mean there are 2 distinct long exposures that are married together to create one final photo. The first exposure was strictly for the sky, and I took 9 identical consecutive images at 20-second exposures over a period of, I think it took me maybe about 3.5 minutes. But then because the Earth is turning, the stars appear to be moving and they're blurred. So I had to stack and align the stars from all 9 images in Photoshop into one consolidated image. And in doing so, it also helped reduce sensor noise that can appear in a photo as muddy green and magenta colors when you have real good low light conditions. And it's in those pixel spaces between the stars. And then without moving my camera, I took a single exposure that was 10 minutes long that was for the water and for the foreground. And it gives definition and detail to the sea stacks and to the coastline. It also smooths out the waves, the breaking waves there, and creates this star shadow from the sea stacks on the water. I then blended the bottom portion, the 10-minute exposure, the parts below the horizon, with the consolidated, stacked and aligned photos from the 9 images of the sky using a blending mask in Photoshop. I made just a few adjustments here to match the white balance and the color of the 2 halves, and that's about it. And I just love the cool blue hues in this photograph. And of course, capturing the shadow cast by the light of the Milky Way onto the water was just such an unexpected thrill. You have no idea. And you could never see that with the human eye, but it's there. This relic of a road is only a couple of miles from my home, and it's like a portal to another time. It's been unchanged and utilized for at least 2,000 years. This is a shining example of what I mean when I say I want to capture what is behind the door. Even without knowing its history, to walk its mile, your senses become alerted to its significance. Its primitiveness is really palpable and immediate. So unlike any of the less remarkable gravel lanes around here on the peninsula, the newly minted ones that are bulldozed and graded and sliced and diced through state parks and land trusts and private communities and estates. This stretch of road is barely broad enough to accommodate the width of a single car. And yet, miraculously, it's never been widened. It's never been paved over, like the other 98% of the length that runs through the county. They don't even plow it in the wintertime. It's absent utility poles and overhead wires and streetlights and road signs and culverts and cottages. There is no evidence of the hand of man along this stretch of road. Can't you just feel the ghost within its midst? Hear the mingling of ancient voices beyond the waves? That's the kind of imagery I set out to capture when I went out this day. I used a 70 to 200 millimeter lens at 200 millimeters to compress the scene, and I put the opening beyond at the center of the frame as if it were an invitation to the viewer, to their curiosity, to explore what secrets the road may yet confess. So this is the second exposure blended photo in the group, and another time sensitive image that I took that needed considerable advanced planning. I actually envisioned this shot a few years earlier, but I had to wait until the trajectory of the full moon swept over the canal entrance. Because the canal faces at this kind of east-southeast direction, from where I wanted to take the photo, a full moon only rises far enough south, passing over the entrance of the canal near the horizon, but still above the tree line. In this way, only once every 7 years and 9 months, according to my PhotoPills app. And that happened to be the evening of May 26th, 2021. And again, I was at the mercy of the weather, fingers crossed for a clear sky. Unfortunately for me, the weather gods were cooperative. So now getting the moon directly centered over the canal entrance more than 3 miles away from where I was standing only gave me a shooting window of about a minute to work with. And another unexpected issue that I had to deal with was vibration. I was standing on the Bayview Bridge, and the hum of the tires from passing traffic traveling over the steel grating vibrated up through my feet. I could feel that. So I was shooting with a 100 to 400 millimeter telephoto lens at 400 millimeters and locked onto my heavy duty tripod. But even then I could feel the vibration traveling up through the legs of the tripod, through the camera and the lens, which would definitely at 400 millimeters result in a blurred image. So I had to minimize this effect by attaching a remote cable release, and I just waited for a break in traffic long enough for me to capture the pin-sharp focus necessary for the detail in that moon on the surface there, shooting at 1/80th of a second. Any slower of a shutter speed and it would have just washed out the moon. It would have looked like a solid white disc. Now, it didn't matter so much for the 5-second exposure for the foreground, but it was absolutely critical to get this exposure for a detailed moon. And again, I only had like a minute to work with. So after hours of waiting and years of planning, the entire shoot took less than, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes from the time I arrived till I was back in my car and on my way home. And then, like the photo from the Oregon coast, I just took the two exposures and blended them together along the horizon in Photoshop. It is such a unique experience to witness the winter fleet coming in off the Great Lakes at this time each year. laying up at Fincantieri-based shipbuilding company until the spring thaw. And the entrance to the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal, yet again, provides the perfect backdrop to show these massive, massive leviathans on the Great Lakes. It shows great scale. I've been following these ore boats since I was a kid, and now I live just a few miles from one of the main hubs of maritime activity in the entire Great Lakes. And those of you who know me, or who are regular visitors here to this channel, know what an absolute boat nerd I am. And I have to say that I discovered as a result of my YouTube channel that there are thousands and thousands more just like me. And I thank you very much for watching those videos. And what's not to love about these boats? And they are boats, by the way. They are not ships. They're not vessels. Boats. Definitely a Great Lakes thing. Anyway, the history of these boats, their beauty, their grace, their grit, everything about them is legendary and inspiring. And this boat in particular is special to me. 728-foot Joseph Block. It's seen here coming home at the entrance of the canal, as it were, because her keel was laid here in Sturgeon Bay in 1976. Her recently retired captain, Ray Sheldon, agreed to do an interview late last winter just before his final sail, and we have since become friends. And this right here, this is the last time Ray nudged her home through the canal before his retirement, his last winter layup. And I thought the setting sun and dramatic sky were appropriate for the occasion. This image of Mendocino County wine country near the coast of Central California was a real test of resolve. I had to wait for hours for this blazing sun to swing around into position, sink low enough in the sky to create these elongated shadows, highlighting the hills and the vineyards, and placing the foreground in complete shadow, and thereby giving it the whole scene just more depth and more contrast. This is actually a 33 exposure blended focus stacked HDR image. I wanted the scene to be entirely in focus from the very front to all the way to the back, using a 16 to 35 millimeter lens at about 20 millimeters. And the only way to achieve that was to focus stack. But then I had to deal also with the high dynamic range. So I bracketed each exposure as well. I shot it one step below nominal exposure, one step above, and of course one at nominal. And after dialing in my composition, I started this sequence of shots. Beginning in the front, I focused on the object that was closest to the lens, that red raspberry, which was only about 11 inches away. And I fired off all my bracketed exposures, but then the raspberry was so close to the lens that the back portion of it actually was out of focus. So I had to refocus just on the back end of that berry and took my 3 bracketed exposures. And then to the bunch of berries to the right of it, I did the same thing. I bracketed those exposures and then moved to the right of that, the leaf, same thing. And I just worked my way back through the scene on 8 different planes until I reached my hyperfocal distance, where everything beyond was in focus, and that was about where the shed with the metal roof is on the left. So I took 8 stacks of 3 exposures for a total of 24 exposures, and when I arrived home, I downloaded each of those 24 images and did some light post-processing on one and then synchronized all 23 others. And then I combined the 3 images from each bracketed group into a single high density resolution image. So then I ended up with 8 images, HDR images. And then I blended those 8 HDR images, I aligned them and made just one composite. And that's this here, the 33rd and final image. It was a ton of work, but it was well worth the effort, I think. And the one thing I should point out here is that if you look at the sky, it looks a bit funky and dull and gray. That's actually smoke hanging in the air from the wildfires that at that time had just recently flared up, devastating large swaths of California this past summer. This was the most peculiar thing I encountered on my photo journey this past year. A caboose in the bottom of a quarry on an island that has no trains. I came across this oddity last March when I traveled up to Washington Island at the tip of the Door Peninsula. I went up there for some astrophotography, and I couldn't resist when I found this. I had to come back that night and shoot it with the Milky Way arching overhead. But it was really difficult to compose because there was the scattering of old wrecks all around me, trucks and boats and cars, all kinds of things laying around like so many dead soldiers on a battlefield. I had such little room to work with, and only a handful, maybe 3 or 4 dimmable LED light panels. Used them all to illuminate the caboose and all the surrounding area as well. And then there's the issue of this color red to deal with. Now, I like a little bit of red in my photos. It's kind of a trademark, I suppose, but man, this monstrosity took up nearly the entire scene. I mean, it's a caboose. And then there's the convoluted story of how this thing got into this quarry in the first place. And believe it or not, it was once a bed and breakfast cottage on the grounds of a resort on Washington Island. And at last, we've come to the 10th image. And boy, this was such a wild afternoon of weather. This is a single frame image taken in the afternoon. That's right, in the afternoon. I know it looks like night. It was back in August in Grand Haven, Michigan, directly across the lake here. And I call it Lucky Strike because this 3/4 of a second exposure, not only was I able to capture 2 cloud to water lightning bolts in one image, but also because only moments before the wind kicked up and the skies grew really dark as night, the string of pier lights along the catwalk automatically came on. And so did the blinking lights of the channel markers and of the inner and outer pier head lighthouses. And all 4 of them I caught flashing at the same time, illuminated at exactly the same time, which really only lasts for 1 or 2 seconds during their flash cycle because they're all on a different cycle. And it goes around about every 2 or 3 minutes. Now, I had never before tried to photograph lightning. But I set my tripod on the water's edge. I composed a shot trying to grab as much sky as I could in the frame using a 16 to 35 millimeter lens, zoomed in, I think, to about 24 millimeters, just so I could bring the lighthouse at the end of the pier in a little bit closer. And then I tried to optimize my settings just by referencing the histogram on the display screen on the back of the camera because it was raining so hard. It was really difficult to try to do. Those settings ended up being, I think, ISO 200, an aperture of f13, and of course the shutter speed at 3/4 of a second. I then put the camera in time-lapse mode, and I set the interval for 1 second, and I just let her rip. And over the next 10 or 12 minutes, I took about 335 images. And then I had to walk back to the car along a deserted beach in the pouring rain. I was soaked to the skin. I was chilled to the bone. But I felt confident that I had managed to catch a few lightning strikes. And it turned out that I captured a lot of 4-star images that afternoon, but only one where everything came together for 3/4 of a second in one single frame. Well, there you have it. My top 10 favorites for 2021. Maybe it included one of yours as well. I hope so. I got some grand plans for 2022 as well. So starting with the winter layup. All the boats have to transit the Soo locks by January 15th, so the next couple of weeks are shaping up to be very busy. And that's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed this little bit of insight as to my photographic process and how I go about rating my images and get a better understanding of why certain photos stand out for me more than others. It isn't just about the aesthetics. Turns out it's about their story. Go figure. Well, thanks for watching, everybody. Take care of yourselves, and until next time, I'll see you down the road.